There's nothing that cuts deeper into a parent's heart than the sound of their child walking away forever. For Eli Yoder, that sound had echoed in his mind for 15 long years, ever since his son Samuel left their Amish community and never looked back. Now 60 years old and walking alone through his wheat fields in 1892, Eli lived with the quiet regret that settles into a man's bones when pride costs him everything that matters. His wife Martha was gone, his farmhouse stood empty, and the land that once felt like a blessing now reminded him daily of all he had lost. But on this summer afternoon, something would change everything. A small voice crying in the wheatwood lead him to a lost little girl whose words about her father would bring Eli to his knees. Could finding someone else's child help heal the wound of losing his own? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The rooster's crow came at 4:30, same as it had every morning for the past 40 years. Eli Yoder's weathered hands found his suspenders in the pre-dawn darkness, muscle memory guiding him through the ritual of dressing. Black wool pants, plain white shirt, and the wide-brimmed hat that had seen more seasons than he cared to count. In the kitchen, he lit the kerosene lamp with practiced efficiency, its warm glow pushing back the shadows that seemed to linger longer in the empty house. Martha used to have coffee ready by the time he finished milking. Now the silence greeted him instead, broken only by the tick of the old mantel clock her father had made as a wedding gift. Eli had grown accustomed to the quiet, though he wouldn't say he preferred it. A man learns to live with many things when the Lord calls his helpmate home. He pulled on his work boots and stepped onto the porch, breathing in the crisp morning air that carried the scent of ripening wheat and the promise of another scorching August day. The field stretched before him like a golden ocean, waves of grain bending in the gentle breeze. This land had been in his family for 3 generations, carved from the Pennsylvania wilderness by his grandfather's calloused hands and stubborn faith. The barn welcomed him with familiar sounds, the shuffle of hooves, the soft lowing of cattle eager for their morning feed. Bessie, his oldest Holstein, turned her brown eyes toward him with patient expectation. She'd been Samuel's favorite, back when the boy had loved following his father through the morning chores. Now, Samuel would be 33, if he was still alive somewhere in the English world beyond the county lines. Eli pushed the thought away as he settled onto the milking stool. No good came from dwelling on what couldn't be changed. The milk sang against the metal pail in a steady rhythm, and he found the familiar comfort in the work. Hands busy, mind at peace. That was the Amish way. "Morning, Eli." The voice belonged to Jacob Stoltzfus, his nearest neighbor and longtime friend. Jacob's farm bordered Eli's on the eastern side, and the 2 men had worked these fields together since they were boys learning to handle a plow. Where Eli had grown lean and angular with age, Jacob had thickened around the middle, his beard now completely gray beneath his straw hat. "Morning, Jacob. You're early today. Sarah's got me looking for one of our hens. Foolbird's been laying her eggs somewhere other than the coop." Jacob leaned against the barn door, his hands clasped behind his back. Thought she might have wandered over this way. Eli finished with Bessie and moved to the next cow. "Haven't seen any visitors, but you're welcome to look around." They worked in comfortable silence for a while, Jacob checking the fence line while Eli completed his milking. When the last cow had been tended to, they walked together toward the house, boots crunching on the gravel path Martha had insisted on laying 5 years before her passing. "You eating proper?" Jacob asked, eyeing the thin line of smoke rising from the chimney. "Well enough." Eli set the milk pail by the kitchen door. "Martha taught me a few things before the Lord called her home." Jacob nodded, but his expression remained concerned. "Bishop Mueller mentioned you missed the last community gathering. Had a sick calf that needed tending. And the one before that? Eli paused, his hand on the door latch. In truth, the community gatherings had become difficult to bear. Too many familiar faces asking after his health, offering well-meaning advice about finding another wife, or worse, carefully avoiding any mention of Samuel. The whole business left him feeling more alone than when he was actually by himself. A man's got responsibilities to his livestock, Jacob. Aye, that he does. But he's got responsibilities to his community, too. Jacob's voice carried the gentle firmness of a lifelong friend. We worry about you, Eli. This place is too big for one man to manage alone. Eli thought of the empty rooms upstairs, the silence that filled the house like stagnant water. Martha's sewing basket still sat beside her chair in the parlor, her thimble and spare buttons waiting for fingers that would never return. Upstairs, in the bureau drawer of their bedroom, Samuel's carved wooden horse lay wrapped in faded blue fabric, the only toy he'd made for the boy, whittled during the long winter nights when Samuel was still small enough to believe his father could shape anything from a piece of wood. I manage fine, Eli said. Jacob studied his face for a long moment. Samuel's choices were his own, Eli. You can't carry that burden forever. The mention of his son's name hit like a physical blow. 15 years had passed since the community had voted to shun Samuel for questioning the ordinal, the unwritten rules that governed every aspect of Amish life. 15 years since Eli had stood before the congregation and, with a breaking heart, supported the decision. The boy had been 19, full of restless questions about the world beyond their fields, challenging the elders with ideas he'd picked up from English books. The boy made his choice, Eli said, the words tasting like ash, and I made mine. Jacob's voice was soft with understanding. But making a choice and living with it are two different things. After Jacob left, Eli stood alone in his kitchen, staring at the cold stove. The morning chores were finished, and the day stretched ahead with its familiar rhythm of work and solitude. He could spend the morning checking the wheat, the afternoon mending fence, the evening with his Bible and the memories that visited him whether he welcomed them or not. Outside, the world was coming alive. Somewhere in the distance, he could hear the Byler children playing in their yard, their laughter carrying on the wind. The sound brought back memories of Samuel racing through these same fields, his small legs pumping as he chased butterflies or pretended to be a warrior defending the farm from imaginary enemies. Martha had worried about the boy's imagination, feared it would lead him away from the simple faith that had sustained their people for generations. She'd been right, though Eli had never admitted it aloud. Samuel had always seen beyond the boundaries of their small world, had asked questions that had no easy answers within the context of their beliefs. Why can't we use automobiles if they'd help us farm better? Samuel had asked when he was 16. Why is it wrong to want to help people in the English world if we have skills they need? Eli had given him the answers passed down from his own father, because pride comes before the fall, because the English world was full of temptations that would steal a man's soul, because their way was the way God had ordained for their people. But even as he spoke the words, he'd seen the doubt growing in his son's eyes. The break had come 3 years later, when Samuel announced his intention to work with an English doctor who treated the poor in Lancaster. The bishop had counseled patience, but Samuel had grown defiant, accusing the community of caring more about rules than about love. When the vote came to shun him until he repented and returned to the fold, Eli had faced the hardest choice of his life. He'd voted with the community, for the good of the church, for the preservation of their way of life, for the hope that losing his family might bring the boy to his senses. But Samuel had simply packed his few belongings and walked away without looking back. The last Eli had seen of his son was his figure disappearing down the lane, shoulders straight with the stubborn pride he'd inherited from his father. Now, as Eli prepared his simple breakfast of bread and jam. He wondered if Samuel was even still alive. The world beyond Lancaster County was vast and dangerous, full of diseases and accidents and 1,000 ways for a young man to lose his way. Every morning for 15 years, Eli had prayed for his son's safety and return. Every evening, he'd gone to bed with the knowledge that his prayers remained unanswered. The day passed as most did, checking the livestock, walking the fence lines, examining the wheat that would be ready for harvest within the month. The grain stood tall and golden, heavy with the promise of a good yield. Martha would have been pleased. She'd always loved harvest time, the sense of completion it brought, the satisfaction of another year's work bearing fruit as the sun reached its peak. Eli found himself in the far corner of his property, where the wheat field gave way to a small woods that had always been Samuel's favorite place to play. The boy had built elaborate fortresses from fallen branches, had spent hours watching birds and squirrels, had come home with pockets full of interesting stones and leaves that Martha had pretended to admire while secretly worrying about the dirt he tracked into her clean house. Eli sat on a fallen log, his hat pushed back, letting the noon sun warm his face. Somewhere in the wheat behind him, a meadowlark called to its mate, the sound sweet and lonesome. This was where he felt closest to the memories, where the years seemed to fold back on themselves, and he could almost hear Samuel's laughter echoing through the trees. A movement in the wheat caught his eye, probably a deer come to sample the grain. He'd have to check the fence again, make sure the animals weren't finding ways through. But as he watched, the movement came again, too small and deliberate to be a deer. Eli stood, shading his eyes against the bright sun. "Hello?" he called. "Someone there?" The wheat rustled, and men went still. Eli walked closer, his boots silent on the soft earth. Years of farming had taught him to move quietly when investigating disturbances in his fields. But as he pushed through the tall stalks, nothing could have prepared him for what he found. A little girl sat huddled among the wheat, her small frame almost lost in the golden sea around her. A dress, once blue, he thought was torn and dirty, her face streaked with tears and dust. She couldn't have been more than 6 years old, with tangled brown hair and eyes the color of storm clouds. When she saw him, she didn't run. Instead, she looked up at him with an expression of such profound exhaustion that it made his chest ache. "Hello, little one," Eli said gently, kneeling down so he wouldn't tower over her. "What are you doing out here all alone?" The girl studied his face for a long moment, taking in his beard and plain clothes. When she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "I'm looking for my papa," she said. "But I've been lost for so long. The lady said he went away like Samuel, and I should find the man with the kind eyes who knows about being sad." Eli's heart stopped. The world seemed to tilt around him as the child's words echoed in his mind. Samuel. She'd said Samuel. How could this little girl, appearing like an apparition in his wheat field, possibly know his son's name? "What did you say?" he whispered. But the girl had started to cry again, great silent tears rolling down her dirty cheeks. Without thinking, Eli reached out and gathered her into his arms, feeling her small body shake with exhaustion and fear. She smelled like wheat dust and summer rain, and when she buried her face against his shoulder, something long frozen in his chest began to crack. "It's all right," he heard himself saying. "You're safe now. I'll help you find what you're looking for." As he carried the child toward his farmhouse, Eli couldn't shake the feeling that finding her had been no accident. In all his years of walking these fields, he'd never encountered anything like this. A lost child who somehow knew his deepest pain, who spoke of Samuel as if she'd known him personally. The empty rocking chair on his porch seemed to watch them approach, its worn wood gleaming in the afternoon sun. For the first time in 15 years, Eli thought he might have someone to fill it. The little girl weighed almost nothing in Eli's arms, her small frame so light he might have been carrying an armload of wheat sheaves. As they approached the farmhouse, she lifted her head from his shoulder and looked around with wide, curious eyes that seemed far too old for her young face. "Is this where you live?" she asked, her voice still hoarse from crying. "Yes," Eli replied, climbing the porch steps carefully. "This is my home." She studied the simple white clapboard house with its green shutters and the wide porch that wrapped around the front. Her gaze lingered on the empty rocking chair, the one that had sat unused since Martha's passing. "It's nice," she said solemnly, "but it looks lonely." The observation hit Eli like a cold wind. From the mouth of a child, the truth seemed especially stark. He pushed through the front door and into the kitchen, setting her gently on one of Martha's ladder-back chairs. "Are you hungry?" he asked, though he could see the answer in the hollow look around her eyes. She nodded eagerly, and Eli busied himself, preparing what he could: bread and butter, a glass of fresh milk, some of the strawberry preserves Martha had put up the summer before she died. The girl watched his every movement with intense focus, as if memorizing everything about this moment. "What's your name, child?" Eli asked as he set the simple meal before her. "Hope," she said, attacking the bread with the desperate hunger of someone who hadn't eaten in far too long. "Hope Elizabeth? That's a beautiful name, Hope." The word felt strange on his tongue, foreign after so many years of living without it. "And your family name?" She paused in her eating, a line appearing between her small eyebrows. "Mama called me Hope Elizabeth Miller, but Papa said I was really a Yoder, like him." Eli's hand trembled as he poured himself a cup of coffee. Yoder. There were other Yoder families in the county, of course. It was a common enough name among the Amish, but combined with her earlier mention of Samuel, the coincidence seemed too profound to dismiss. "Tell me about your papa," he said carefully, settling into the chair across from her. Hope's face brightened despite her exhaustion. "Papa was tall and had brown hair like mine. He used to carry me on his shoulders and tell me stories about when he was little. He said he grew up on a farm with wheat fields that went on forever and ever." Eli's chest tightened. "What kind of stories?" "About a wooden horse he had when he was small. About his mama, who made the best bread in the whole world. About his papa, who could fix anything that was broken." She took a long drink of milk, leaving a white mustache on her upper lip. "But then he got sick, and he couldn't tell stories anymore." "Sick?" Hope nodded sadly. "He coughed all the time, and it made him so tired. The doctor man said his lungs were bad. Papa tried to get better, but..." Her voice trailed off, and fresh tears gathered in her eyes. Eli reached across the table and took her small hand in his weathered one. "What happened then, little one?" "He went to sleep and didn't wake up," she whispered, "like Mama did when I was just a baby. Aunt Sarah said Papa went to heaven to be with Mama and Jesus." The words hit Eli like physical blows. A young man named Samuel Yoder, dead of consumption, leaving behind a daughter who spoke of wooden horses and wheat fields. The pieces were falling into place with terrible clarity. "This Aunt Sarah," Eli said, his voice barely steady. "She took care of you after your papa died?" Hope nodded. "But Aunt Sarah got scared. She said she couldn't keep me anymore because she didn't have enough money, and the landlord was mean. She put me on a wagon with some nice people who said they were coming this way. And then the wagon man said he couldn't take me all the way to where Papa used to live. He left me at a crossroads and said someone would come along to help." She bit her lip, a gesture so achingly familiar that Eli's heart nearly stopped. Samuel had done the same thing when he was nervous or uncertain, but nobody came for a long time. "I walked and walked until I got so tired. Then I saw the wheat and remembered Papa's stories, so I went to look for the farm with the kind man who had sad eyes." Eli stared at this child, this impossible gift that had appeared in his fields like an answer to 15 years of desperate prayer. If her story was true, if she was indeed Samuel's daughter, then she was his granddaughter. His blood, his family, the continuation of a line he'd thought broken forever. "Hope," he said gently. "What was your papa's full name?" "Samuel David Yoder," she said without hesitation. "He said he was named after a king in the Bible and a man who fought a giant." The room seemed to spin around Eli. Samuel David Yoder, the exact name he and Martha had given their son 33 years ago. The boy who had left their community in anger and pride, who had disappeared into the English world without a trace, who had apparently lived and loved and died without ever coming home. And he had named his daughter Hope. Papa talked about his home all the time. Hope continued, unaware of the upheaval her words were causing in Eli's mind. He said there was a big white house with a porch and fields that turned gold in the summer. He said his papa was the strongest man in the world and could make anything grow. Eli's vision blurred with unshed tears. Did your papa ever say why he left his home?" Hope's expression grew puzzled. "He said he made his papa angry by asking too many questions. He said he was sorry about that, but he couldn't help wanting to know things." She leaned forward conspiratorially. "Papa was really smart. He could read any book and remember everything in it." "Yes," Eli whispered. "He always could. Papa said someday he would take me to see the farm where he grew up. He said maybe his papa wouldn't be angry anymore, and we could all be a family." Hope's voice grew wistful. "But then he got too sick to travel anywhere." Eli stood abruptly, turning toward the window so the child wouldn't see the tears streaming down his face. Outside, the wheat fields swayed in the afternoon breeze. The same fields where Samuel had played as a boy, where he'd built his dreams and asked his dangerous questions. Now those same fields had delivered his daughter back to the home he'd never been able to return to himself. "Mister?" Hope's small voice called from behind him. "Are you crying?" Eli wiped his eyes and turned back to her, this miraculous child who carried Samuel's eyes and his stubborn chin, and his gift for asking questions that cut straight to the heart of things. "Yes," he said honestly. "Sometimes grown-ups cry when they're very happy and very sad at the same time." Hope considered this seriously. "Like when Papa used to look at Mama's picture? Exactly like that." She slipped down from her chair and came to stand beside him, slipping her small hand into his. "Large one, don't be sad, mister. Papa said sad feelings are just love with nowhere to go. Maybe your love can go to me now." The simple wisdom of it nearly broke him. Here was his granddaughter, orphaned and alone, offering comfort to the grandfather she didn't even know she'd found. The child Samuel had created, carrying his compassion and his father's stubborn hope. "Hope," Eli said, kneeling down so they were eye to eye. "I think I knew your papa when he was a little boy." Her eyes widened. "Really? Was he your friend?" Eli's throat constricted. How did you explain to a 6-year-old that her father had been more than a friend, that he'd been a son, lost to pride and stubbornness and the unbending rules of a community that valued conformity over questions? "He was very special to me," Eli said finally. "And that means you are very special to me too." Hope smiled for the first time since he'd found her, a radiant expression that transformed her tear-stained face. "Does that mean I can stay with you? Aunt Sarah said I needed to find someone who would love me like Papa did." Eli looked into those storm gray eyes, Samuel's eyes, and felt something shift in his chest. The empty space that had ached for 15 years suddenly felt less hollow, filled with possibility and purpose and the faintest glimmer of redemption. "Yes," he heard himself say. "You can stay." But even as he spoke the words, Eli knew the reality would be far more complicated. The Amish community had strict rules about outsiders, about children born outside the faith, about the consequences of associating with the shunned. Taking in Samuel's daughter, a child born in the English world, to parents who had turned their backs on the Amish way would require him to face questions he wasn't sure he was ready to answer. But as Hope threw her small arms around his neck and whispered, "Thank you," against his ear, Eli decided that some things were worth fighting for. Some gifts from God came wrapped in complications, and a man's job was to unwrap them with gratitude, not fear. Outside, the sun was beginning its descent toward the horizon, painting the wheat fields gold and amber. Somewhere in those fields lay a piece of torn blue fabric, caught on a wheat stalk like a flag marking the place where everything had changed. Eli had found his granddaughter. Now he had to figure out how to keep her. That evening, as twilight settled over the farm like a gentle quilt, Eli found himself facing challenges he hadn't encountered in decades. Hope sat at Martha's small kitchen table, freshly washed and wearing one of his old shirts that hung on her like a nightgown. Her own dress lay soaking in the wash basin, the blue fabric slowly releasing days of accumulated dirt and travel stains. "I've never seen a house so quiet," Hope said, her voice carrying in the stillness. At Aunt Sarah's, there were always people arguing upstairs and carriages rattling past the window. Eli ladled soup into a bowl, trying to remember the last time he'd prepared a meal for someone other than himself. Martha's apron still hung on its wooden peg beside the stove, a daily reminder of all the domestic rituals he'd never had to master. Now, watching Hope's expectant face, he felt the weight of his inexperience. "Farm life is different from city life," he said, setting the bowl before her. "Out here, we listen to the sound of the wind and the animals rather than people and machines." Hope tasted the soup, a simple broth with vegetables from Martha's garden, and smiled. "Papa would have liked this. He always said the best food came from the ground, not from stores. Smart man, your papa." He was. Hope swung her legs under the table, her bare feet not quite reaching the floor. "He used to say that when I was bigger, he'd teach me to grow my own vegetables. But then he got too tired for teaching." Eli felt the familiar stab of loss, compounded now by the knowledge that Samuel had been a father himself. How many moments had his son experienced alone? The joy of Hope's first steps, her first words, the 1,000 small milestones that made up a childhood? All of it happening in a world Eli would never know, with no one to share the pride and worry that came with raising a child. "Tell me more about your papa," Eli said, settling into the chair across from her. "What did he like to do?" Hope's face brightened. "He loved books more than anything. Our room was full of them, books about medicine and farming and faraway places. He read to me every night, even when the coughing made it hard for him to talk. Medicine? Papa helped sick people. He said it was important work, even if it didn't pay much money." Hope paused in her eating. Is that why his papa was angry? Because helping people isn't important enough? The question cut deep, exposing the heart of the conflict that had torn their family apart. How could Eli explain the complex web of tradition and fear that had led to Samuel's shunning? How could he make a 6-year-old understand that sometimes good people made terrible choices in the name of preserving what they thought was right? "Your papa's papa wasn't angry because the work wasn't important," Eli said carefully. "He was scared that your papa would get hurt by the English world. But papa did get hurt. He got sick and died." Hope's logic was devastating in its simplicity. Maybe if he'd stayed home, the medicine doctors could have helped him get better. Eli's throat constricted. She was right, of course. If Samuel had remained in the community, if the family had stayed together, perhaps they could have recognized the signs of his illness earlier. Perhaps the outcome would have been different. "Sometimes grown-ups make mistakes," Eli said quietly. "Sometimes we let fear make our choices instead of love." Hope studied his face with those two knowing eyes. "Are you papa's papa?" The directness of the question left Eli speechless. Here was Samuel's gift for cutting through pretense and reaching the truth, inherited by his daughter along with his stubborn chin and quick mind. "What makes you think that?" Eli asked. "You have the same sad look Papa got when he talked about home. And your hands look just like his, strong but gentle." Hope reached across the table and touched his weathered fingers. "And when I said his name, you cried the way Aunt Sarah did when she talked about people who went to heaven." Eli marveled at the child's perception. At 6 years old, she already possessed an emotional intelligence that some adults never developed. Samuel had been the same way, able to read faces and voices, to understand the feelings behind the words. "Yes," Eli said finally. "I am your papa's papa, which makes me your grandpapa." Hope's smile was radiant. "I knew it. Papa said I would. Know his papa when I met him because he would have kind eyes that looked sad. You said all the best people had sad eyes because they cared about things that hurt. Your papa was a wise man. The wisest." Hope yawned suddenly, the excitement and exhaustion of the day finally catching up with her. "Grandpapa, can I sleep in Papa's old room tonight?" The request sent a jolt through Eli's chest. Samuel's room had remained untouched since the day he left, not as a shrine, but because Eli had simply never found the strength to pack away the remnants of his son's childhood. The narrow bed with its plain quilt, the wooden chest that held outgrown clothes and forgotten treasures, the window that looked out over the wheat fields where Samuel had spent so many hours dreaming of the world beyond. "Are you sure you wouldn't be more comfortable in the parlor? I could make up a bed on the sofa. I want to sleep where Papa slept when he was little." Please? How could he refuse her anything? This child who had walked out of his wheat fields like an answer to 15 years of prayer, who carried Samuel's blood and his bright spirit, who had somehow found her way home when her father never could. "Of course," Eli said. "Let me show you the way." They climbed the narrow stairs together, Hope's small hand gripping the banister that Samuel's hands had worn smooth decades before. The upstairs hallway felt different with her presence less, like a tomb of memories and more like a living space waiting to be filled again. Samuel's room was exactly as he'd left it. The bed with its blue and white quilt that Martha had sewn by hand. The wooden chest at the foot of the bed, carved with simple flowers by Eli's own father. The small window that faced east, toward the sunrise and the road that led to the wider world. Hope walked around the room slowly, touching things with reverent fingers. She paused at the chest, running her hand over the carved wood. "Papa had a box like this in our room. He kept his important things in it." "What kind of important things?" "Letters from people he helped get better, a picture of Mama when she was young, and a little wooden horse that he said his papa made for him when he was small." Eli's breath caught. The wooden horse, he'd carved it during the winter when Samuel was 4, whittling by lamplight while Martha mended clothes and the boy slept peacefully in his bed. Samuel had carried it everywhere for months, galloping it across the kitchen table and through imaginary adventures in the yard. "Would you like to see the room where your papa's papa and Mama slept?" Eli asked. Hope nodded eagerly, and he led her across the hall to the bedroom he'd shared with Martha for 30 years. Everything here spoke of her presence. The quilt on the bed, the brush and mirror on the dresser, the rocking chair by the window, where she'd sat to mend clothes and watch the sunset. But it was the bureau that drew Eli's attention now. In the bottom drawer, wrapped in a piece of faded blue fabric, lay the original wooden horse, the twin to the one Samuel had apparently kept until the day he died. "Grandpapa?" Hope's voice was sleepy now, heavy with the exhaustion of travel and emotion. "Will you tell me a story about Papa when he was little?" Eli tucked her into Samuel's old bed, pulling the quilt up to her chin. In the lamplight, she looked so much like Samuel had at that age that it took his breath away. "Once upon a time," he began, settling into the chair beside the bed, "there was a little boy who loved to ask questions about everything he saw." As Hope's eyes grew heavy and her breathing deepened, Eli continued the story, not a fairy tale. but the truth about a curious boy who had loved this farm and his family, who had grown up to care too much about a hurting world, who had died far from home, but had somehow sent his greatest treasure back to the place where love had first taken root. When Hope finally slept, Eli remained in the chair, watching over his granddaughter and marveling at the mysterious ways that God chose to answer a desperate man's prayers. Dawn came too early and not soon enough. Eli had spent most of the night in Samuel's old chair, dozing fitfully while keeping watch over Hope. Every few hours, she would stir and call out in her sleep, sometimes for her papa, sometimes for someone named Aunt Sarah, once for her mama, whom she'd never really known. Each time, Eli would whisper quiet reassurances until she settled back into peaceful slumber. Now, with the rooster's crow announcing another day, he faced the practical realities of his situation. Hope was awake and looking around the room with fresh curiosity, as if seeing it clearly for the first time. She'd slept deeply, her small body finally relaxed after what must have been days of fear and uncertainty. "Good morning, Grandpapa," she said, sitting up in bed with her hair sticking out in all directions. The simple words sent warmth flooding through Eli's chest. "Good morning, little one. Did you sleep well?" "Better than I have in a long time." Hope swung her legs over the edge of the bed, her bare feet touching the cool wooden floor. "I dreamed about Papa. He was young like in the story you told me, and he was showing me how to milk a cow." Eli smiled despite the ache in his heart. Samuel always was good with the animals. "Would you like to learn to milk a cow today?" Hope's face lit up. "Could I really?" "We'll start with Bessie. She's the gentlest of the bunch. But first, there were more immediate concerns." Hope's dress was still damp from its washing, and she couldn't spend the day wearing one of his oversized shirts. In Martha's sewing basket, Eli found fabric and thread, but his clumsy fingers had never been suited for such delicate work. "I'm afraid I'm not much of a seamstress," he admitted, holding up a piece of blue cotton that Martha had been saving for a summer dress she'd never had the chance to make. "Aunt Sarah taught me a little bit about sewing," Hope offered. "Maybe we could figure it out together?" The idea of a 60-year-old man and a 6-year-old girl attempting to create clothing together would have been laughable under other circumstances. But as they sat at Martha's kitchen table, Hope's small fingers guiding his large ones through the basic stitches, Eli found himself experiencing a contentment he hadn't felt in years. Papa used to say that the best way to learn something was to try it and not be afraid of making mistakes, Hope said, concentrating intensely on her needlework. He said mistakes were just practice in disguise. "Smart man," Eli murmured, watching her careful stitches. She had Samuel's patience and precision, the same ability to focus completely on the task at hand. They were interrupted by the sound of a wagon approaching. Through the kitchen window, Eli could see Jacob Stoltzfus climbing down from his seat, his expression puzzled as he noticed the unfamiliar small clothes hanging on the wash line. "Grandpapa, who is that?" Hope asked, looking up from her sewing. Eli's stomach clenched. He'd known this moment would come, but he'd hoped for more time to figure out how to explain Hope's presence. "That's my neighbor Jacob. He's a good man." But he paused, uncertain how to explain the complexities of community life to a child. "Hope, I need you to stay very quiet while I talk to him. Can you do that for me?" Hope nodded solemnly, her eyes wide with understanding that this was important. Eli stepped onto the porch just as Jacob reached the front steps. His friend's gaze immediately went to the small dress hanging on the line, then to the toys Hope had been playing with that were scattered on the porch. "Morning, Eli," Jacob said carefully. "Looks like you have a visitor." "Morning, Jacob." Eli's mind raced, searching for the right words. "What brings you by so early?" "Sarah sent me to borrow some sugar for her baking." Jacob's eyes never left. The evidence of a child's presence. "Eli, whose little girl is staying with you?" Through the kitchen window, Eli could see Hope sitting perfectly still at the table, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes fixed on him with absolute trust. The weight of that trust settled on his shoulders like a physical burden. Eli began, then stopped. How could he explain without revealing everything? She's a child who needed help. I couldn't turn her away. Jacob's expression grew. Troubled. Eli, you know the Ordnung as well as I do. Taking in outsiders, especially children, requires community approval. Bishop Mueller needs to know about this. I understand your concern, Jacob, but this isn't about my concern. It's about our way of life. Jacob's voice carried the weight of generations of tradition. We have procedures for these situations. The child should be turned over to the English authorities who can find her proper placement. The thought of Hope being taken away, of losing her before he'd even had a chance to truly know her, sent panic racing through Eli's veins. She's not going anywhere. Jacob studied his friend's face with growing alarm. Eli, what aren't you telling me? Who is this child? Before Eli could answer, the kitchen door opened and Hope appeared, her small face grave with concern. She walked directly to Eli's side and slipped her hand into his, looking up at Jacob with those storm-gray eyes that were so heartbreakingly familiar. Don't be angry with Grandpapa, she said quietly. He's taking care of me because Papa can't. Anymore. Jacob's face went pale. His gaze moved from Hope to Eli and back again, taking in the resemblance that was becoming more apparent with each passing moment. Grandpapa? Jacob whispered. Eli felt the last of his pretense crumble away. Jacob, I'd like you to meet Hope Elizabeth. She's Samuel's daughter. The words hung in the morning air like a thunderclap. Jacob stared at Hope as if she were an apparition, his weathered hands gripping the porch railing for support. Samuel's butt? That's impossible. Samuel was shunned. He left the community 15 years ago. And he lived in the English world. He married, had a daughter, and died 6 months ago. Eli's voice was steady despite the turmoil in his chest. Hope is my granddaughter, Jacob. She's all that's left of my son. Jacob's eyes filled with a mixture of sympathy and concern. Oh, Eli, the boy is truly gone? Consumption. He was 33 years old. Hope tugged on Eli's sleeve. Grandpapa, why does the man look so sad now? Because he knew your papa when he was a little boy, Eli explained gently. Mr. Jacob was Papa's friend. Hope stepped forward with the fearless curiosity that seemed to be her nature. But Papa said his friends at home were good people who would understand about helping others. Are you going to help Grandpapa take care of me? Jacob knelt down to Hope's level, his expression softening despite his obvious distress. Little one, it's not that simple. There are rules. Papa said rules were supposed to help people, not hurt them. Hope interrupted with Samuel's characteristic directness. Are your rules going to hurt me and Grandpapa? The question struck like an arrow, finding its mark. Jacob looked from Hope to Eli, clearly struggling with the conflict between his loyalty to community law and the reality of an orphan child who needed care. The bishop will have to be told, Jacob said finally. This affects the whole community. Eli, you know that. I know. Eli's arm tightened protectively around Hope's shoulders. But I also know that this child is my blood, my family. Samuel may have been shunned, but Hope has done nothing wrong. She's innocent of whatever sins we laid at her father's feet. The sins of the fathers are not visited on the children. Not in my house. Eli's voice carried a firmness that surprised them both. She stays, Jacob. Whatever it costs me, she stays. Jacob stood slowly, his face heavy with the weight of friendship and duty. I'll give you until tomorrow before I speak to Bishop Mueller. Use that time wisely, Eli. Think about what you're risking. After Jacob left, Hope looked up at Eli with troubled eyes. Did I make things bad for you, Grandpapa? Eli knelt and gathered her into his arms, breathing in the sweet scent of her hair and marveling at how natural it felt to hold her. No, little one. You can never make things bad. You've made them better than they've been in 15 years. But the man was worried about rules. Sometimes rules and love don't agree with each other. When that happens, a man has to choose which one matters more. Hope considered this seriously. Papa always chose love, even when it was hard. Yes, Eli sighed, his voice thick with emotion. He did, and so will I. That afternoon, as they worked together in the garden, Hope's small hands helping to gather vegetables while she chattered about everything she saw, Eli found himself in Samuel's old bureau drawer looking for something he hadn't touched in 15 years. Samuel's last letter lay where he'd left it, unopened and yellowed with age. The return address was from Philadelphia, dated just 2 months before the community had voted to shun him. Eli had been too angry and hurt to read it then, too proud to acknowledge that his son might have anything to say worth hearing. Now, with Samuel's daughter playing in the garden outside, Eli held the letter with trembling hands and wondered if he finally had the courage to learn what his son's final words to him had been. The decision to travel to Lancaster came after a sleepless night spent watching Hope sleep and wrestling with the weight of unanswered questions. Samuel's unopened letter lay on the kitchen table like an accusation, but Eli found he still lacked the courage to break the seal. Some truths, once learned, could never be unknown, and he feared what his son's final words might reveal about the depth of his own failures as a father. But Hope deserved answers about her family, about the circumstances that had led to her father's exile and death. And if Eli was going to fight for the right to keep her, he needed to understand the full story of Samuel's life in the English world. "Grandpapa, where are we going?" Hope asked as Eli hitched the wagon early the next morning. She wore the simple dress they'd managed to complete together, the blue fabric bringing out the gray in her eyes. "To town," Eli replied, checking the harness connections. "We need to find out more about your papa's life before you came to me." Hope climbed onto the wagon seat beside him, her small legs swinging with nervous energy. "Will there be lots of people?" "Some. Are you worried about that?" She considered the question seriously. Papa said cities had too many people and not enough quiet. But he also said they had libraries with more books than anyone could read in a whole lifetime. Eli smiled despite his anxiety. Even at 6, Hope carried Samuel's love of learning like a torch passed from father to daughter. "Maybe we'll find time to visit the library." The journey to Lancaster took most of the morning, the wagon wheels rolling steadily over familiar roads that Eli had traveled for 40 years. But everything felt different with Hope beside him, her constant questions and observations transforming the mundane trip into an adventure seen through fresh eyes. "Look, Grandpapa, that bird is following us. Why do some farms have red barns and others have white ones? What makes the horses know which way to go?" Each question reminded Eli of Samuel at the same age, endlessly curious about the world around him. Martha used to joke that their son would ask the Lord himself for explanations when he reached heaven. Now, listening to Hope's bright chatter, Eli wondered if Samuel had found those answers at last. Lancaster town bustled with its usual mixture of Amish farmers, English shopkeepers, and travelers passing through on the railroad. Hope pressed close to Eli's side as they walked down the main street, her eyes wide at the sight of so many people and buildings crowded together. "It's so loud," she whispered. "Cities usually are. Your papa lived in one much bigger than this." They made their first stop at the county clerk's office, a stern brick building that housed the official records of births, deaths, and property transfers. The clerk, a thin man with wire-rimmed spectacles, looked up from his ledger with barely concealed impatience. "What can I do for you?" he asked, taking in Eli's plain clothes and Hope's obvious anxiety. "I'm looking for information about a man named Samuel Yoder. He would have lived in Philadelphia, died about 6 months ago." The clerk's expression softened slightly at the mention of death. Relation? My son. The words came easier now. The truth no longer a source of shame, but a simple fact that connected him to the child at his side. I'll check what we have on file. While they waited, Hope wandered over to examine a large map of Pennsylvania hanging on the wall. She traced the roads with her finger, following the lines that connected small towns to larger cities. Is this where Papa lived? She asked, pointing to a spot marked Philadelphia. Yes. Far from here. Why did he go so far away? The question struck at the heart of everything Eli had been avoiding. Sometimes people leave home when they can't find a way to stay and be true to themselves. Hope frowned, struggling to understand. But Papa always said home was the most important thing. He said family was worth more than anything else in the whole world. Before Eli could respond, the clerk returned with a folder of documents. Samuel David Yoder died March 15, 1892, age 33. Cause of death listed as consumption. Is this your man? Eli's heart clenched at the stark official. Summary of his son's life. Yes. What else do you have? Not much, I'm afraid. He was living in a boarding house on Vine Street, working as an assistant to a Dr. Marcus Henley. No property, minimal possessions. There's a note here that he had a daughter, but no information about her whereabouts after his death. Hope tugged on Eli's sleeve. That's me. I'm the daughter. The clerk looked down at her with surprise. Well, I'll be. You're a long way from Philadelphia, little miss. I came to find my grandpapa, Hope said matter-of-factly. Papa told me how. The clerk's eyebrows rose, but he simply nodded. Smart girl. Dr. Henley might have more information about your father if you're looking to learn more about his time in the city. Armed with Dr. Henley's address, Eli and Hope continued their search. The doctor's office was located in a modest building near the outskirts of town, its simple shingle advertising medical services for all who need them. Dr. Henley proved to be a kindly man in his 50s, with gentle hands and tired eyes that spoke of long days spent tending to the sick and poor. When Eli introduced himself as Samuel's father, the doctor's face lit up with recognition and sadness. Samuel Yoder, yes, indeed. One of the finest men I ever had the privilege to work with. Dr. Henley shook Eli's hand warmly. I was deeply grieved to lose him. He had a gift for healing that went beyond medical training. You knew him well? As well as anyone, I suppose. He worked with me for nearly 3 years, tending to patients who couldn't afford traditional medical care. Samuel had a way with people. They trusted him instinctively. The doctor's gaze fell on Hope, who was examining the medical instruments displayed in a glass case. And this must be little Hope. Samuel spoke of her constantly. Hope looked up with interest. You knew my papa? I did indeed. He was very proud of you. Dr. Henley knelt to her level. Lava, he used to say you were the smartest little girl in all of Philadelphia, and that someday you'd do great things in the world. Papa said I could be anything I wanted to be if I worked hard and was kind to people. Wise advice. The doctor stood and addressed Eli. May I ask what brings you here? Samuel told me his family was, that is, he said there were difficulties at home. Eli felt the familiar stab of guilt. We had differences about the path his life should take. I lost my son to pride and stubbornness, doctor. I'm hoping to learn enough about his life to honor his memory properly. Dr. Henley's expression grew. Thoughtful, Samuel often spoke of his father. He regretted the breach between you more than anything else in his life. Even at the end, when the consumption was taking him, he talked about finding a way to come home. The words hit Eli like physical blows. Samuel had wanted to come home, even after 15 years of separation, even after the community had cast him out. His son had still thought of their farm as home. Did he? Eli's voice cracked. Did he die alone? No, Dr. Henley said gently. Hope was with him, and several of our patients who had come to love him. He spoke your name at the end, Mr. Yoder. He asked God to tell his father that he was sorry for the pain he'd caused. Hope moved to Eli's side, slipping her small hand into his as tears began to flow down his weathered cheeks. Don't cry, Grandpapa. Papa's not hurting anymore. Dr. Henley watched this exchange with evident emotion. If I may say so, Mr. Yoder, your son's greatest regret was that he couldn't bring Hope to meet you. He wanted desperately for you to know her, to see what a remarkable child he'd raised. He did bring her to me, Eli said quietly, looking down at Hope's trusting face. Just not the way any of us expected. The doctor nodded with understanding. Samuel always believed in the mysterious ways of providence. He said God had a plan for everyone, even when that plan was hard to see through the pain. As they prepared to leave, Dr. Henley pressed a small bundle into Eli's hands. These were Samuel's things. I kept them hoping someday someone from his family would come for them. There's not much, but there are some letters and a few personal items that belonged to him. Outside the doctor's office, Eli and Hope sat on a bench while he examined the bundle. Among the few possessions were several letters addressed to patients, a small Bible with notes written in the margins, and a carved wooden horse identical to the one hidden in Eli's bureau drawer at home. Papa's horse! Hope exclaimed, recognizing the toy immediately. He told me stories about the man who made it for him when he was little. Eli held the small carving with trembling hands, remembering the winter nights he'd spent shaping it by lamplight, the joy on 4-year-old Samuel's face when he'd first seen it. His son had carried this piece of home with him for 30 years, through all the pain and separation and eventual loss. Grandpapa, Hope said softly, Papa really did. Love you, didn't he? Yes, Eli whispered, and I loved him. We just forgot how to show it. As they began the journey home, Hope fell asleep against Eli's shoulder, exhausted by the emotional weight of the day. The afternoon sun slanted across the wheat fields, painting everything golden and peaceful. But Eli's mind was churning with new understanding about his son's life and death, and with growing certainty about what he needed to do. Samuel had spent 15 years trying to find his way home. Now it was Eli's turn to bridge the gap between past and present, between the community's rigid expectations and the love that transcended all boundaries. Hope deserved to know both sides of her heritage, the traditions that had shaped her father and the wider world he'd chosen to serve. But first, Eli needed to face the community's judgment and fight for the right to keep Samuel's daughter where she belonged, home. With the grandfather who loved her more than his own life, the train ticket to Philadelphia felt like a small piece of paper that weighed as much as a millstone. Eli turned it over in his weathered hands, studying the printed destination that represented everything his community taught him to fear. Philadelphia, the great English city where men lost their souls to worldly temptations, where the faithful went astray and never found their way back to God's simple path. But Samuel had lived there. Samuel had died there. And somewhere in that vast, bewildering place lay the final pieces of his son's story. Are we really going to ride on the iron horse? Hope asked, pressing her face against the train station window. Her breath fogged the glass as she watched the massive locomotive hiss and pant like some great mechanical beast. We are, Eli confirmed, though his own stomach churned with apprehension. He had never traveled beyond Lancaster County, had never needed to venture into the English world that now seemed to be calling him toward answers he both craved and dreaded. Hope's excitement was infectious, her wonder at every new sight and sound helping to calm his nerves. She had her father's fearless curiosity, the same hunger for new experiences that had eventually led Samuel away from the safety of home. The train car was a revelation in its self-polished wood and brass fixtures, cushioned seats that seemed impossibly luxurious compared to their simple wagon. Hope sat beside the window, her nose pressed to the glass as the Pennsylvania countryside rolled past in a blur of farms and forests. "Look how fast everything goes by," she marveled. "Papa said the train could go faster than the fastest horse." But I didn't believe him. Eli watched the familiar landscape disappear behind them and felt as if he were leaving more than just geography. Every mile took him further from the world he understood, deeper into the realm his son had chosen over. Family and faith. "Papa rode this same train when he left home," Hope said suddenly, her voice thoughtful. "Do you think he was scared?" The question cut straight to Eli's heart. Had Samuel been frightened that day 15 years ago when he'd walked away from everything he'd ever known? Had he looked back at the disappearing farms and wondered if he was making a terrible mistake? "I think your papa was brave," Eli said carefully. "But brave people can be scared too. Sometimes being scared just means you're doing something important." Hope considered this wisdom seriously. "Are you scared now, Grandpapa?" "A little," Eli admitted. "But having you with me makes it easier." Philadelphia overwhelmed the senses from the moment they stepped off the train. The noise hit first, the clatter of carriages on cobblestones, the shouts of vendors hawking their wares, the constant murmur of hundreds of voices speaking at once. Then came the smells: coal smoke and horse manure, baking bread, and something else Eli couldn't identify, something sharp and metallic that seemed to coat the inside of his nose. Hope gripped his hand tightly as they made their way through the crowded station. Her earlier excitement had given way to wide-eyed wariness as she took in the sheer scale of the city around them. "It's so big," she whispered. How did Papa ever find his way around? Eli wondered the same thing. The streets seemed to stretch endlessly in all directions, lined with buildings taller than any structure he'd ever seen. People hurried past without making eye contact, each absorbed in their own urgent business. How had his son, raised on quiet farmland, adapted to this chaos? They found Samuel's former boarding house on Vine Street after asking directions from 3 different strangers. The building was narrow and shabby, squeezed between a bakery and a shop that sold used clothing. A hand-painted sign in the window advertised clean rooms, fair prices. The landlord, Mr. O'Malley, was a stout man with kind eyes and the lilting accent of Ireland. When Eli explained their purpose, his weathered face softened with genuine sympathy. Samuel Yoder, I remember him well. Quiet fellow, always reading his medical books by lamplight. Paid his rent on time and never caused trouble. He looked down at Hope with recognition dawning. And you'd be his little girl. He talked about you constantly, showed everyone the letters you'd send him. I could write letters? Hope asked, surprised, but I was just little. Drawings, mostly, Mr. O'Malley chuckled. Pictures of flowers and houses and stick figures that he said were you and him together. He kept everyone. Eli felt another stab of loss. Samuel had treasured his daughter's childhood artwork the way most fathers did, finding joy in her innocent expressions of love. But he'd experienced that joy alone, with no family to share the pride and wonder of watching a child grow. I kept his things in storage, hoping someone would come for them, Mr. O'Malley continued. Didn't seem right to just throw away a man's whole life. The storage room was little more than a closet, but it contained the sum total of Samuel's worldly possessions. A few changes of clothes, carefully mended. A collection of medical texts, their pages worn from frequent study. A small wooden crate filled with papers and personal items. And at the bottom of the crate, wrapped in a piece of faded blue cloth, lay a journal bound in cracked leather. Eli's hands trembled as he opened the cover. The first page was inscribed, in Samuel's careful handwriting, the thoughts and observations of Samuel David Yoder, in the hope that someday my father might understand the choices I have made. Hope peered over his shoulder at the neat rows of text. What does it say, Grandpapa? Eli's throat constricted as he read the opening lines aloud. I write these words not in anger or defiance, but in love for the man who raised me and the community. That shaped my earliest understanding of faith and duty. If you are reading this, Father, then perhaps God has found a way to bridge the gap that my pride and your fears have created between us. The journal chronicled Samuel's years in Philadelphia, his struggles to find work, his discovery of his calling as a healer, his joy when hope was born, and his grief when her mother died in childbirth. But woven through every entry was his love for his father and his desperate hope for eventual reconciliation. March 1st, 1891. Hope asked me today why she doesn't have grandparents like other children. I told her about you, Father, about your strong hands and gentle heart, about the way you could make anything grow from the soil. I pray that someday she will know you, that you will see in her the best of what I tried to become. Tears blurred Eli's vision as he continued reading. Page after page revealed the depth of Samuel's love and regret, his constant struggle between the world he'd chosen and the home he'd never stopped missing. December 25th, 1891, another Christmas away from home. I taught Hope to sing the old hymns today, the ones Mother used to love. She has your voice, Father, clear and true. Sometimes when she sings, I can almost imagine we're all together in the old farmhouse, the way we were when love was simpler than pride. Hope listened quietly as Eli read selected passages aloud, her young mind absorbing the evidence of her father's deep affection for the grandfather she was only now coming to know. "Papa really missed you," she said finally. "Why didn't he just come home?" It was the question that had tormented Eli for 15 years. Sometimes adults make things too complicated, little one. Sometimes we let rules become more important than love. The journal's final entries were written during Samuel's last illness, his handwriting growing shakier as the consumption weakened him. But his love remained constant, his hope undiminished even in the face of death. February 20th, 1892. The doctor says I have perhaps a month remaining. My greatest sorrow is not for myself, but for Hope, who will be alone in this world. My greatest hope is that somehow, someway, she will find her way to you, Father. She carries the best of all of us, your strength, Mother's gentleness, and perhaps something of my stubborn determination to see good in even the darkest places. The last entry was dated just 3 days before Samuel's death. I am going home at last, Father. Not to the farm, I remember, but to the place where all wounds are healed and all questions are answered. If love survives death, and I believe it does, then watch for Hope. God will show her the way to the love she deserves, the family she needs. I trust in His mysterious grace to heal what my pride broke. Eli closed the journal with shaking hands, overwhelmed by the magnitude of his son's love and the tragedy of opportunities lost forever. Samuel had died believing in redemption, trusting that God would guide his daughter home to the grandfather he'd never stopped loving. "Grandpapa," Hope said softly, slipping her small hand into his. "Papa found a way to bring us together after all, didn't he?" Through his tears, Eli managed to smile. "Yes, little one, he did." As they prepared to leave Philadelphia with Samuel's possessions and his final messages of love, Eli felt the last of his doubts fade away. The journal had revealed the truth he'd needed to hear. Samuel had never stopped being his son, and Hope was the bridge between past and future, the living proof that love could transcend even death itself. Now he had to return home and fight for the right to honor that love, whatever the cost to his standing in the community that had shaped his entire life. The revelation came not in Samuel's journal, but in a bundle of letters hidden beneath the false bottom of his wooden crate. Eli might never have found them if Hope hadn't noticed that the box seemed lighter than it should be for its size. Her small fingers, exploring while he read the journal, had discovered the secret compartment that contained what Samuel had considered his most precious possessions. "Grandpapa, there's something else in here," Hope said. tugging at a loose board in the bottom of the crate. When the wood came away, it revealed a cavity containing perhaps a dozen letters, all addressed to Samuel, in various hands. But it was the bundle tied with a faded red ribbon that made Eli's heart stop. These letters were in Samuel's own handwriting, addressed to Eli Yoder, Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, letters his son had written but never sent. Mr. O'Malley, who had been watching their discovery with respectful silence, shook his head in wonder. In all the months I knew him, I never saw Samuel mail a single letter home. But he wrote constantly, always writing in that little room of his. I wondered what he was doing with all that paper. Eli's hands trembled as he untied the ribbon. The letters were arranged in chronological order, spanning the entire 15 years of Samuel's exile. The first was dated just weeks after his departure from the community. June 15th, 1877. Dear Father, I know you will never read these words, but I cannot stop myself from writing them. I am in Philadelphia now, staying in a boarding house that smells of cabbage and loneliness. Every morning I wake expecting to hear the roosters crow, and every evening I search for familiar stars in a sky crowded with chimney smoke. I was wrong to leave in anger, but I was not wrong to leave. Please understand the difference. Hope watched with solemn eyes as Eli reads silently, his face cycling through expressions of grief, wonder, and growing understanding. These letters were Samuel's true voice, unfiltered by the formality of the journal, raw with emotion and intimate detail. The second letter revealed the depth of Samuel's struggle. July 3rd, 1877. I found work today, assisting a doctor who treats the poor. The pay is little, but the work feels like prayer. Today I helped deliver a baby to a woman who had no money for proper care. When I held that tiny life in my hands, I thought of you and Mother, of the way you taught me that all life is sacred. I am doing God's work here, Father, even if it is not the work you would choose for me. As Eli continued reading, a picture emerged of his son's life that was both heartbreaking and inspiring. Samuel had struggled with poverty, loneliness, and constant homesickness, but he had also found purpose and joy in serving others. His letters spoke of patients saved, children delivered safely, and the gradual building of a new kind of community among the outcasts and forgotten of the great city. Then came the letter that changed everything, dated 2 years after Samuel's departure, August 12, 1879. Father, I must tell you about Mary. She is the most beautiful woman I have ever seen, with brown hair that catches the light like autumn leaves and a voice that could gentle the wildest storm. She works at the hospital, caring for orphan children with a tenderness that reminds me of Mother. I love her, Father. I love her with my whole heart, and she has agreed to be my wife. I know this grieves you, that you would have wanted me to find a wife among our people. But Mary shares my faith in different words, and she understands the calling that brought me here. I pray that someday you will meet her and see what I see, a woman worthy of love, worthy of the Yoder name. Eli's breath caught. Samuel had married in 1879, 13 years ago, which meant hope had been born into a loving household, not the desperate circumstances Eli had imagined. The next several letters chronicled Samuel and Mary's early married life, their shared work among the poor, and their growing happiness together. Samuel's voice in these letters was lighter, filled with joy and hope for the future. December 1st, 1880. Mary is with child, Father. Our baby will be born in the spring, when the world is full of new life and possibility. I have chosen names. Already hope for a daughter, in honor of the hope that brought me through my darkest days, and David for a son, after the king who found his way back to God's favor despite his mistakes. I want our child to know about you and Mother, about the farm where goodness grows in straight rows and faith is as solid as the earth itself. Tears streamed down Eli's face as the story unfolded. Samuel had planned from the beginning to reconnect with his family, to bridge the gap between his two worlds. The letter dated just after Hope's birth was almost unbearable in its tenderness. April 15th, 1881. She is perfect. Father, Hope Elizabeth Yoder came into this world with storm gray eyes and a voice that could wake the angels. Mary says she has my stubborn chin, but I see Mother's gentleness in the way she sleeps. I held her this morning and told her about her grandfather, about the man who carved wooden horses and could make anything grow. Someday, I promised her, she would meet the finest man I have ever known. But the letters also revealed a growing shadow. Mary's health had never fully recovered from childbirth, and Samuel's own constitution was weakening under the strain of long hours and exposure to disease. The letter dated 6 months later carried the first hint of the tragedy to come. October 20th, 1881. Mary grows weaker each day. The doctor says her heart was damaged during Hope's birth, and there is little we can do but pray and treasure the time we have left. She makes me promise daily that I will take Hope home to you if anything happens to her. Every child needs grandparents, she says, and Hope deserves to know where her father learned to be good. Mary's death, when it came, nearly broke Samuel's spirit. His letters from that period were dark with grief and doubt, filled with questions about God's purpose and his own ability to raise a daughter alone. January 3rd, 1882. Mary is gone, Father. The light is gone out of the world, and I am left alone with a 10-month-old daughter who will never know her mother's laugh. I rage against God's plan, against the cruel randomness that takes good people. Too young. But then Hope smiles at me, and I see Mary's eyes in her face, and I remember that love continues even when the beloved is gone. The most shocking revelation came in a letter dated 5 years later, September 14th, 87. I received word today that Mother has passed. A stranger in Lancaster told me she died peacefully in her sleep, and that you spoke her name at the end. I wept for hours, Father, not just for the loss of her, but for the lost years when I could have comforted you in your grief, when Hope could have known her grandmother's love. My pride has cost us all so much. Eli's hands shook so violently he could barely hold the paper. Samuel had known about Martha's death, had grieved alone in his city room while Eli had grieved alone on the farm. Two men separated by stubbornness, when they could have comforted each other. But the final letters revealed Samuel's determination to overcome the barriers between them. Beginning in 1890, his tone became more purposeful, more focused on finding a way home. June 1st, 1890. Hope is 9 now and growing more beautiful each day. She asks constant questions about you, about the farm, about the grandfather she has never met. I tell her stories every night about the wooden horse you carved for me, about Mother's bread, about the way the wheat fields look at sunset. She listens with such hunger, Father. She needs her family, needs to know where she comes from. The penultimate letter, dated just months before Samuel's death, contained his detailed plan. November 15th, 1891. I am coming home, Father. The consumption grows worse each week, and I know my time is short. But before I die, I must bring hope. To meet you, I must heal the wounds my pride created. I have saved enough money for the journey, and I have written to Bishop Mueller requesting permission to return, not to rejoin the community, but simply to reconcile with my father before God calls me home. Hope had been listening to portions of the letters as Eli read them aloud, her young mind struggling to process the complexity of adult emotions and decisions. Now she tugged on his sleeve with urgent concern. Grandpapa, why are you crying so? Hard? Eli looked at this precious child, his granddaughter, his second chance, his link to the son he had lost through pride and fear, and tried to find words adequate to the moment. Because your papa loved us more than I ever knew, he said finally. And because he spent his whole life trying to come home to us. But he did come home. Hope said with the simple wisdom that seemed to flow from her naturally. "He sent me to find you." Maybe that was his plan all along. The final letter, dated just weeks before Samuel's death, confirmed Hope's innocent insight. February 1st, 1892. "I am too weak now to make the journey myself, but I have a better plan. If God calls me before I can come to you, I will send Hope. She knows the stories, knows the way to the farm, knows that somewhere in Lancaster County lives a grandfather who will love her as I have loved her. I have taught her to be brave, to trust in the goodness of strangers, to believe that love always finds a way. If you are reading this, Father, then my plan has worked. Hope has found her way home, and my greatest prayer has been answered." Eli gathered Hope into his arms, understanding at last that her appearance in his wheat fields had been no accident. Samuel had orchestrated this reunion from beyond the grave, using his daughter's courage and God's mysterious grace to heal a wound that had festered for 15 years. Samuel had kept his promise. He had brought his daughter home. The journey home from Philadelphia felt different than the trip out. Where before Eli had been seeking answers, now he carried them, along with the weight of what those answers meant for his future and hopes. Samuel's letters lay carefully preserved in his satchel, evidence of love that had transcended death itself. But letters, no matter how profound, would not be enough to convince Bishop Mueller and the community council to accept Hope as one of their own. Hope dozed against his shoulder as the train carried them back toward Lancaster County, exhausted by the emotional intensity of discovering her father's hidden correspondence. In sleep, she looked even more like Samuel, the same stubborn set to her jaw, the same long eyelashes that had made Martha declare their son too pretty for his own good. But there was something else in Hope's face, something that reminded Eli of himself at her age, an unshakable conviction that right would prevail simply because it was right. If only the world were that simple. "Grandpapa." Hope's voice was drowsy as she stirred against his shoulder. "When we get home, will the people like me?" The question pierced his heart. How could he explain the complexities of Amish law to a 6-year-old? How could he prepare her for the possibility that the community might demand her removal from the only family she had left? "Some will," he said carefully. "Others might need time to understand how special you are. Papa said some people's hearts were just smaller than others. But he said small hearts could grow bigger if you gave them enough love." Eli marveled once again at the wisdom Samuel had instilled in his daughter. Even facing death, his son had prepared Hope for a world that might not immediately welcome her, while maintaining her faith in the essential goodness of humanity. "Your papa was a smart man." "The smartest," Hope agreed sleepily. "Will you show the people Papa's letters? Will they understand then?" "I hope so, little one. I hope so." But as the familiar landscape of Lancaster County rolled past the train windows, Eli's certainty wavered. The letters proved Samuel's love for his family, but they also documented his life in the English world, his marriage outside the faith, his work among outsiders, his deliberate choice to remain apart from the community that had shaped his childhood. To some members of the congregation, Samuel's letters might be seen as evidence of his continued defiance rather than proof of his enduring love. The farmhouse looked smaller when they returned, as if the journey to Philadelphia had somehow expanded Eli's sense of scale. But it also looked more welcoming, more like a home meant to shelter a family rather than house a lonely old man's regrets. Hope ran through the rooms, reacquainting herself with the spaces that had become dear to her in just a few short days. "Look, Grandpapa, the flowers in the garden grew while we were gone." She was right. Martha's sunflowers had opened their faces to the sun, and the vegetable garden showed new growth. Life had continued in their absence, a reminder that the world moved forward regardless of human drama and heartbreak. But as evening approached, Eli knew their peaceful interlude was coming to an end. Jacob Stoltzfus appeared at the kitchen door just as Eli was preparing supper, his expression grave with purpose. "Bishop Mueller wants to see you," Jacob said without preamble. "Tomorrow after morning services. He's calling a special meeting of the church council." Ella had expected this, but hearing it confirmed still sent ice through his veins. And Hope? He wants to meet her too, to assess her situation. Jacob's voice carried sympathy, but also resignation. "Eli, I've done what I could to speak for you, but the bishop has concerns." "Taking in the child of a shunned member, the child of my son," Eli interrupted firmly. "Aye, your son, who was cast out for rejecting our ways." Jacob glanced toward the parlor where Hope was playing with her father's wooden horse. "The girl seems sweet enough, but she's not been raised in the faith. She doesn't know our customs, our language, our understanding of God's will." "She knows love," Eli said. "She knows kindness and compassion and the value of helping others. Isn't that the heart of any faith worth following?" Jacob sighed heavily. "That's not for me to decide, old friend. But I fear the council will see her as a disruption to our order, a reminder of Samuel's defiance." After Jacob left, Eli sat at his kitchen table with Samuel's letters spread before him. He read them again, searching for passages that might sway hearts and minds, evidence that Samuel had never truly abandoned the values instilled in him during his childhood. But he also prepared himself for the possibility that love and logic might not be enough to overcome generations of tradition and fear. "Grandpapa, why do you look so worried?" Hope had appeared in the kitchen doorway, her hair tousled from play and her face bright with innocent curiosity. She climbed onto the chair beside him and studied the letters with grave attention. "Tomorrow I have to talk to some very important people about whether you can stay here with me." Eli explained gently. Hope considered this information seriously. "Are they good people?" "They try to be, but sometimes good people disagree about what's right. Papa said when people disagreed, the best thing to do was listen with your heart instead of just your head." Hope traced one of Samuel's letters with her finger. "Will you tell them about Papa's heart?" "I'll try, little one." "And will you tell them about my heart too? How it feels happy here with you." Eli lifted her onto his lap, breathing in the sweet scent of her hair and marveling at how quickly she had become essential to his happiness. "I'll tell them everything that matters." That night, Eli barely slept. He walked the floors of his quiet house, rehearsing arguments and appeals, trying to anticipate every objection the council might raise. Hope's presence had transformed this space from a museum of memories into a living home. Her laughter echoed in rooms that had been silent too long. Her questions and observations brought new life to routines that had grown stale with repetition. How could he make the council understand that losing her would be like losing Samuel all over again? Dawn came gray and overcast, with clouds heavy with the promise of rain. Eli prepared for the day with the solemnity of a man heading to his own judgment. He dressed in his finest clothes, the black suit he wore to weddings and funerals, and carefully arranged Samuel's letters in order of importance. Hope wore her best dress, the blue one they had sewn together, and she had braided her hair with the careful precision Samuel must have taught her. She understood the gravity of the situation, even if she couldn't grasp all its complexities. "Are you scared, Grandpapa?" "A little," Eli admitted as they walked toward the meeting house. "But having you with me makes me braver." The meeting house sat on a small rise overlooking the valley, its simple white walls and plain windows reflecting the community's commitment to humility and simplicity. Eli had worshipped in this building for 40 years, had brought Samuel here as a baby and watched him grow into a questioning young man who eventually found these walls too confining for his expanding faith. Now he was bringing Samuel's daughter to the same place, hoping for a different outcome but fearing history might repeat itself. Bishop Mueller waited in the front room with 4 other council members. Men Eli had known for decades, neighbors and friends who had shared births and deaths, harvests, and hardships. Their faces were kind but reserved, shaped by the weight of making decisions that affected the entire community's spiritual welfare. "Eli," Bishop Mueller said formally, "and this must be the child." Hope stepped forward with Samuel's characteristic directness. "My name is Hope Elizabeth Yoder, and I'm very pleased to meet you." The bishop's eyebrows rose slightly at her poise and perfect manners. "Child, do you understand why you're here?" "To see if I can stay with my grandpapa," Hope replied simply. "Because Papa can't take care of me anymore, and Grandpapa is the only family I have left. And what do you know of our ways? Of the faith your grandfather follows?" Hope looked up at Eli for guidance, then back at the stern-faced man arrayed before her. "I know that Grandpapa prays before every meal and reads his Bible every night. I know he takes care of his animals and grows food to feed people. Papa said those were the most important things, loving God and loving others." Bishop Mueller exchanged glances with the other council members. This was not what they had expected from a child raised in the English world. "Eli," the bishop said, turning his attention to the man who had stood silent during this exchange, "Jacob Stoltzfus has informed us of your situation. You understand the gravity of taking in the child of a shunned member?" "I understand that. She is my granddaughter," Eli replied steadily. "My blood, my family, and my responsibility. Samuel made his choice 15 years ago. The consequences of that choice should not fall on an innocent child," Eli interrupted, his voice carrying more force than he had intended. "Hope has done nothing wrong. She is guilty of nothing except being born to parents who loved each other and loved her." He reached into his satchel and withdrew Samuel's letters. "Before you make your decision, I ask you to consider these. They are letters my son wrote but never sent, documenting his life in Philadelphia and his constant desire to return home. They prove that he never stopped loving his family or honoring the values you taught him." Bishop Mueller took the letters with obvious reluctance. "Eli, I understand your pain, but read them," Eli said firmly. "Read them and tell me if they are the words of a man who abandoned his faith, or the words of a son who found a different way to serve God's will." The bishop's walking stick tapped against the wooden floor as he considered Eli's request. Around them, the other council members waited in tense silence, while Hope stood perfectly still, her small hand gripping Eli's with quiet determination. Outside, thunder rumbled in the distance, and the first drops of rain began to spatter against the meeting house windows. The storm that had been building all day was finally ready to break. The silence in the meeting house stretched like a taut wire as Bishop Mueller opened the first of Samuel's letters. Rain drummed against the windows with increasing intensity, as if the heavens themselves were weighing in on the decision being made within these plain white walls. Hope stood perfectly still beside Eli, her small hand clasped in his weathered one, both of them watching the bishop's face for any sign of softening. The other council members, Deacon Byler, Elder Stoltzfus, Jacob's father, Minister Lapp, and Deacon Zook sat on the wooden bench that had witnessed countless community decisions over the decades. Their faces carried the weight of men who understood that their choice today would ripple through generations, affecting not just Hope's future, but the community's understanding of mercy versus law. Bishop Mueller read silently, his lips moving slightly as he absorbed Samuel's words. Occasionally his eyebrows would rise or his expression would shift, but he gave no clear indication of his thoughts. The minutes stretched endlessly, broken only by the sound of rain and the occasional creak of old wood settling. Finally, the bishop looked up from the letters and fixed his gaze on Eli. "These are powerful words. Brother Yoder, your son writes with deep feeling about his love for family and his commitment to serving others." "He does," Eli replied, his voice steady, despite the tremor in his chest. Samuel never stopped being the boy you baptized, Bishop. He just found a different way to live out his faith. Different, yes, but also contrary to our ordinance. The bishop's voice carried the authority of decades spent interpreting community law. Samuel chose to work among the English, to marry outside our faith, to raise his daughter in the world we have set ourselves apart from. Elder Stoltzfus leaned forward. With respect, Bishop, the letters also show Samuel's constant desire to return home. He speaks repeatedly of wanting to reconcile with his father and introduce his daughter to our community. Wanting and doing are different things, Deacon Byler interjected. Samuel had 15 years to return and seek forgiveness. He chose instead to remain in his rebellion. Hope's grip on Eli's hand tightened, and he could feel her small body trembling with the effort to remain silent. But her discipline held. She understood instinctively that speaking out of turn could damage their cause. Samuel was dying, Eli sighed quietly. The letters make it clear that he was too ill to travel by the end. His plan was to send Hope to me if something happened to him. This child standing before you is Samuel's final act of faith, his trust that love would guide her. Home to family. Minister Lapp, who had remained silent until now, spoke with measured words. The child herself seems well-mannered and respectful, but she has been raised outside our ways. She knows nothing of our customs, our Pennsylvania Dutch language, our understanding of plain living. She knows love, Eli replied with growing passion. She knows compassion and kindness and the value of helping others. Are these not the fruits we hope to see from our faith? Deacon Zook shook his head. But without proper foundation in our beliefs, how can we know she will not follow her father's path? How can we risk the spiritual contamination of our young people? The harsh words sent anger flashing through Eli's chest. Spiritual contamination? You speak of my granddaughter as if she were diseased. Brother Yoder, Bishop Mueller said firmly, control yourself. We are here to discuss what is best for the community and for the child. But Hope had heard enough. Despite Eli's earlier warnings about remaining silent, she stepped forward with the same fearless directness that had marked her father's character. Excuse me, she said politely, her clear voice cutting through the tension. May I say something? The council members exchanged surprised glances. Children did not typically speak in formal proceedings, but Hope's quiet dignity commanded attention. Bishop Mueller nodded slowly. You may speak, child. Hope looked around the room, meeting each man's eyes in turn. Papa told me that the most important thing about any church was whether it helped people or hurt them. He said God looks at hearts, not rules. Deacon Byler's face flushed. Child, you cannot possibly understand. I understand that my papa died helping sick people who had no money for doctors. Hope continued, her voice growing stronger. I understand that Grandpapa has been sad and lonely for 15 years because his son went away. And I understand that families are supposed to love each other, not throw each other away because they disagree about things. The words hung in the air like a challenge. Here was a 6-year-old child, raised in the English world, speaking truths that cut to the heart of their community's central tension. The balance between preserving their way of life and living out. The love that was supposed to motivate that preservation. Elder Stoltzfus cleared his throat. The child speaks with wisdom beyond her years. She speaks with her father's voice, Deacon Zook countered, which is precisely what we should fear. Hope turned to face Deacon Zook directly. Are you afraid of my papa, sir? Even though he's in heaven now? The question was so innocent, so direct, that it left the older man speechless. How could he explain that, yes, he was afraid of Samuel's questions, his challenges to accepted wisdom, his insistence that faith should expand rather than contract when faced with human need? Bishop Mueller tapped his walking stick against the floor, calling for order in the discussion that was threatening to spiral beyond his control. The wooden staff had been carried by every bishop of their community for 3 generations, worn, smoothed by countless hands grappling with difficult decisions. "We will take a brief recess," he announced. "The council needs to confer privately." As the 5 men huddled in quiet discussion, Eli and Hope waited on their bench, listening to the rain and watching lightning flicker through the windows. Hope leaned against her grandfather's side, her small body radiating trust despite the uncertainty of their situation. "Did I say the wrong things, Grandpapa?" she whispered. Double quotes, "No, little one. You said exactly what needed to be said." The council's discussion grew heated, voices rising and falling in urgent debate. Eli caught fragments words about precedent and tradition, about mercy and justice, about the future of their community's children. Finally, Bishop Mueller called them back to order, his face grave with the weight of decision. Bishop Mueller stood, slowly, his walking stick supporting his weight as he faced Eli and Hope with the gravity of final judgment. The rain had intensified outside, drumming against the meeting house roof like impatient fingers, while lightning illuminated the windows in brief, stark flashes. The storm seemed to echo the tension crackling through the small room where 5 decades of community wisdom wrestled with one child's simple request for a home. "Brother Yoder," the bishop began, his voice carrying the measured cadence of a man accustomed to pronouncing verdicts that shaped lives. "The council has reviewed your son's letters and heard testimony from both you and the child. We have weighed the requirements of our ordinance against the claims of blood and mercy." Hope's grip on Eli's hand tightened, her small fingers clinging to his weathered palm like a lifeline. Eli could feel his own heart hammering against his ribs, but he kept his expression steady, drawing strength from the trust radiating from his granddaughter's presence. "We are not unmoved by Samuel's words," Bishop Mueller continued. "His letters reveal a man who struggled with the tension between obedience and conscience, who never ceased to love the family and community that shaped his youth. In this, we see evidence that our teaching took root in his heart, even when his actions suggested otherwise." Elder Stoltzfus nodded slightly, his weathered face showing the first hint of sympathy Eli had seen from the council. "Your son's care for the sick and poor reflects values we hold dear, even if his methods were not our own." But Deacon Byler's expression remained stern. "Yet we cannot ignore that Samuel chose exile over submission. He married outside our faith, raised his daughter in the English world, and made no attempt to return or seek forgiveness until death approached, because he knew he would not be welcome," Eli said quietly, the words escaping before he could stop them. "Because 15 years ago, this community chose law over love and drove away a young man whose only crime was asking difficult questions." The boldness of his statement sent a ripple of shock through the council. No one had spoken so directly about the circumstances of Samuel's shunning in all the years since his departure. "Minister," Lapp's face flushed with indignation. "Brother Yoder, you speak as if the community acted in malice. Samuel was offered every opportunity to repent and return. He chose his path." "As did we," Eli replied, his voice growing stronger with conviction. "We chose fear over faith, rigidity over love. We let a young man walk away rather than wrestle with the questions he raised about how to live faithfully in a changing world." Hope looked up at her grandfather with wide eyes, sensing the shift in his tone, the emergence of a courage that had been dormant for 15 years. This was not the same man who had voted with the community all those years ago, supporting his son's exile rather than risk standing against tradition. And now, Eli continued, his gaze moving from council member to council member, "You have the chance to choose differently. Hope is not Samuel. She is innocent of whatever rebellion you saw in her father. She is a child who needs family, who carries Samuel's best qualities without his questions or challenges to your authority." Bishop Mueller raised his hand for silence. Brother Yoder, your passion is noted, but my passion is all I have left. Eli interrupted, his voice carrying decades of suppressed grief and regret. I lost my son to pride his pride, yes, but also my own. I will not lose his daughter to the same stubborn adherence to rules that value conformity over mercy. The bishop's walking stick tapped sharply against the floor. You speak dangerously close to defiance, Brother Yoder. Then let me speak clearly, Eli said, rising to his feet with hope still clutching his hand. If this community cannot find room for one small girl whose only crime is loving a grandfather she barely knows, then perhaps this community has lost its way. The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the rain and Hope's quiet breathing. The council members stared at Eli as if seeing him for the first time, not the compliant widower who had quietly accepted his losses, but a man finally willing to fight for what mattered most. It was Hope who broke the tension, her small voice cutting through the charged atmosphere with devastating simplicity. Papa said God's house had many rooms, she said, looking directly at Bishop Mueller. He said there was always space for one more person if you made the rooms with love instead of rules. Elder Stoltzfus's eyes filled with unexpected tears. Out of the mouths of babes, he murmured. Deacon Zook shifted uncomfortably on the bench. The child speaks prettily, but she does not understand the complexities. She understands better than we do, Elder Stoltzfus said firmly, surprising everyone with his interruption. She understands that faith without love is just empty ritual. Minister. Lapp looked torn, glancing between his fellow council members and the small girl, who had challenged everything they thought they knew about protecting their community's spiritual welfare. Bishop Mueller studied Hope for a long moment, his stern expression gradually softening as he took in her earnest face and quiet dignity. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a note of wonder. Child, if we were to allow you to stay among us, would you be willing to learn our ways? To attend our schools and worship with our people? Hope nodded eagerly. Yes, sir. Papa said, learning new things made you stronger, not weaker. And would you honor the memory of your father by serving others as he did? I would try my very best. Hope promised solemnly. The bishop looked at his fellow council members, seeing the shift in their expressions, the gradual recognition that rejecting this child would diminish rather than protect their community's spiritual integrity. Then let us vote, he said quietly, setting down his walking stick and folding his hand in prayer. Not as judges rendering sentence, but as servants seeking God's will for his children. 6 months had passed since the council's vote, and autumn had painted the Lancaster County countryside in shades of gold and amber that reminded Eli daily of the afternoon he'd first found Hope wandering in his wheat fields. The harvest was long finished, the grain safely stored, and the land rested under a blanket of fallen leaves that crunched beneath their feet as they walked the familiar paths together. Hope had grown in those months, not just taller though. She had stretched like a weed in Martha's old garden, but wiser and more confident in her place within the community that had ultimately chosen love over law. Her Pennsylvania Dutch was improving daily, though she still peppered her speech with the precise English Samuel had taught her. The other children had accepted her with the easy grace of youth, and she'd quickly become known for her gentle way with animals and her endless questions about everything she observed. Grandpapa, look, Hope called from the edge of the woods, where she'd been gathering kindling. The red maple has new baby trees growing underneath it. Eli smiled as he watched her excitement over the small saplings sprouting in the shadow of their parent tree. She had Samuel's eye for life in all its forms, his wonder at the miraculous ordinariness of growing things. But where Samuel's curiosity had eventually led him away from home, Hope seemed rooted in this place, as if she'd been waiting her whole young life to belong somewhere. The farmhouse had changed too. No longer the tomb of memories it had been during his years alone. It hummed with the sounds of daily life, Hope's laughter echoing from the kitchen where she helped prepare meals, her voice raised in the old hymns Martha had loved, her footsteps racing up and down the stairs as she moved between the room that had been her father's and the daily routines that were shaping her new life. The empty rocking chair on the porch had been joined by a smaller one, crafted by Eli's own hands during the long winter evenings. They sat there together each sunset, Hope chattering about her day at the community school, while Eli listened and marveled at the gift he'd been given. Sometimes she would fall asleep against his shoulder, and he would carry her inside with the same tender care he'd once shown Samuel. The circle of love completing itself across the generations. The community had kept its promise. Bishop Mueller, whose heart had proven larger than his initial reservations, had personally overseen Hope's instruction in their ways and beliefs. But he'd done so with remarkable sensitivity, allowing her to maintain connection to her father's memory while helping her understand her place in this new family of faith. "Your papa would be proud," the bishop had told Hope just the week before, after she recited her first passage of Scripture in Pennsylvania Dutch. He raised a daughter who honors both her heritage and her future. Elder Stoltzfus had become Hope's unofficial grandfather figure within the broader community, teaching her to identify birds and sharing stories of Samuel's childhood that Eli had forgotten. The old man's eyes would grow distant when he spoke of the boy who had asked too many questions, and Eli suspected his friend carried his own regrets about the choices made all those years ago. Even Deacon Byler, who had been Hope's most vocal opponent during the council meeting, had gradually warmed to her presence. She had a gift for melting resistance with her genuine interest in others and her complete lack of judgment about their sometimes stern demeanor. Just last Sunday, Eli had caught the deacon slipping Hope a piece of candy after services, his weathered face soft with grandfatherly affection. "She reminds me of my own granddaughter at that age," Byler had admitted quietly, full of questions and completely fearless about the world. The changes weren't limited to Hope's integration into community life. Eli himself had emerged from the isolation that had defined his years as a widower. Having a child to care for had restored his sense of purpose, but more than that, the experience of fighting for Hope's acceptance had awakened something in him that had been dormant since Samuel's departure. Willingness to speak truth, even when it challenged comfortable assumptions. He'd become an advocate for other families facing difficult decisions, offering his own story as evidence that mercy could coexist with tradition. Just last month, he'd spoken privately with the parents of a young man whose questions about Amish education were causing concern among some community members. "Listen to him," Eli had counseled. "Ask him to explain his thinking instead of dismissing his doubts. Questions aren't always rebellion. Sometimes they're just a young mind trying to understand how to live faithfully in a complicated world." Samuel's letters had been carefully preserved in the family Bible, a testament to love that had survived death and separation. Hope read them sometimes when she missed her father most acutely, finding comfort in the evidence of his constant thoughts of home and family. The wooden horse Samuel had carried with him to Philadelphia sat on her dresser beside the matching one. Eli had carved decades earlier twin symbols of connection across time and circumstance. "Grandpapa," Hope said as they walked back toward the house, her arms full of kindling and her face bright with the crisp autumn air. "Do you think Papa knows I found you?" Eli considered the question seriously, as he always did when Hope asked about the mysteries that occupied her young mind. "I think your papa is watching over us both, little one. I think he's happy that his plan worked so well." "His plan?" "To bring us together. To give us both a family again." Hope skipped ahead toward the farmhouse, then turned back with a radiant smile. It was a very good plan. Papa was always smart about things like that. As they approached the porch, with its two rocking chairs waiting side by side, Eli felt the deep contentment that comes from understanding that some stories have endings worth waiting for. The wheat fields that had delivered hope to him were brown and stubbled now, resting, until spring would call them back to life. But the love that had brought them together continued to grow. Like those maple saplings, Hope had discovered new life emerging from old roots, connecting past and future in an endless cycle of hope. Samuel had kept his promise. He had found a way to come home at last, carried in the heart and spirit of the daughter who had walked out of the wheat fields and into the grandfather's arms, completing a circle of love that death itself had not been able to break. That evening, as Hope knelt beside her bed for prayers, she added the same request she'd made every night since coming to live with Eli. And please tell Papa that Grandpapa and I are taking good care of each other, just like he wanted. Eli stood in the doorway, listening to his granddaughter's words, and feeling the presence of his son like a benediction over their small, restored family. Outside, the wind whispered through the bare branches of the maple trees, carrying promises of spring and renewal, of seasons yet to come and love that would endure through all of them.